Hey everyone, Mr. Rogers here with the first part of my lectures for my world history class on the late 19th century European and world history. So, what this part is going to do is it's going to take us through the first part of my PowerPoint slides and lecturing on the age of the late 19th century, which would be roughly the 1860s to the beginning of the First World War. So this will give you all the context you need to understand what was going on when the guns of August started firing at the beginning of World War One. So I'm going to take you through all of these different factors of what was going on in the world and particularly in Europe in the 19th century. So the thing that's important to understand about 19th century Europe is that it's the birth of the modern world as we know it. Many of the technological advances that we take for granted for today were created in the late 19th century or massively expanded their accessibility to your average person, particularly in Europe and North America. Many of the ways of life that we take for granted today as people who live in Philadelphia, a city of over 1 million people, that happened in the cities like modern day Philadelphia were born in the late 19th century. That is the point when most human beings, particularly again in North America and Europe, began living not in the countryside, not in rural areas, but in cities. And change began happening in the late 19th century faster than any other point in history up to that point. Now, when you think about what's going on today with cell phone change and computer change, with just a new cell phone every year that has such massively different features and changing the way we live our day-to-day life, changes like that began in the late 19th century with developments like the telephone, the telegraph, fast railroads, things like that. Change is happening at a pace that human beings were just not used to before this time period. And the final point is cultures were interacting more deeply than ever before. And that's mostly in a very negative way that we'll get to at the end of this first part of this lecture series, thanks to the massive expansion of European imperialism. But cultures were deeply enmeshed because, again, a lot of these technological chains shortened space and time. The telegraph meant that you could communicate with parts of the world that would sometimes take weeks or months to communicate with, could now happen in a matter of hours or days. Railroads made it so that you could travel hundreds of miles in a single day, shortening space, shortening time. And steam power allowed boats to go faster, so it was faster to travel from Europe to North America, from North America to Asia, from Asia to Africa, from Africa to Europe. It was much faster to just travel, whether by train or by sea. So again, these are sort of the 5 major features of the rapid age of change that was the late 19th century. There are sort of 5 key themes that we're going to be talking about in both parts of this lecture. But the first part is only really going to be focused on those first 2 points, which are in many ways the largest, which is the development of industrial capitalism and a technological revolution that I just hinted at earlier, and European imperialism, and North American imperialism too. But we're going to focus mostly on European imperialism. And then the third, fourth, and fifth key themes of this period, nationalism, militarism, and imperial alliances, I'll talk about in the second part of this lecture series. So let's jump right into the first theme. So the first theme is industrial capitalism. So throughout the 19th century, new forms of capitalism were developed in Europe and North America. And this process massively accelerated after 1856 with the invention of a new form of steel production. So steel could now be produced cheaply, strongly, and in massive quantities. All right. So we take steel as a technology massively for granted. Our buildings, the house that I'm recording this from, yes, Philly, the building, they're all built with steel. And that is the durability of that metal and its ability to hold massive amounts of weight is going to revolutionize what human beings are capable of doing. They're able to build skyscrapers. They're able to build these powerful ships and trains that can move quickly and just a whole variety of things. We take steel for granted, and steel was not particularly good steel that you could build a building out of was not cheap before the process that was invented in 1856. And that steel was not just the only new technology, or good steel was not the only new technology that was invented between 1870 and 1914. There were a bunch of things that we, again, take for granted today were invented in this period. The telephone. All right, the telephone, we take it so for granted today that it lives in our pocket. But, imagine a time that your great maybe at this point, grandparents didn't have a telephone. The telephone was invented. The automobile was invented. The airplane was invented. The machine gun was invented. Electricity was invented, or electricity was mastered by human beings for its own use. The photograph was invented. The sewing machine was invented. The modern sewing machine was invented. These are all things that we take for granted sitting here in the 21st century in 2020, but these were all brand new technologies that revolutionized what human societies were capable of producing and what kind of jobs people could do. And these new technologies, thanks to steel and the invention of other technologies, were now cheaply produced and could become widely available. Now, obviously, not everything was widely available right away. Airplanes wouldn't become widely available until later in the 20th century. The telephone wouldn't become widely available until later in the 20th century. But the machine gun, electricity, sewing machines, these are all things that were becoming very, very available, if not for a normal person, but for businesses. And that was massively revolutionizing the kinds of jobs and kinds of work that people could find. These changes led to new ways of life. So in Europe and North America, more people were living in cities rather than the countryside for the first time in history. In Europe and North America, more people were working in factories than were farming by the end of this period. And the assembly line was invented, which meant that things were produced faster and cheaper, but had the dark side of workers were more expendable and paid less. All right? So it's important to understand what the assembly line does. So the assembly line makes it so that companies can produce things much more easily, right? So instead of one or two workers building an entire, we'll just use a car as an example, a car from scratch, what would happen instead was, person A would work on part A, person B would work on part B, person C would work on part C, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and you would just pass it down the line. That lets you make more cars faster. But it only means that people have to have one specific set of skills to do that. And in many ways, that makes people more interchangeable. And that means that their labor is of less value to their employers, makes them more expendable, and allows employers to pay them less. And that is, of course, going to lead to a massive decline in quality of life for working people, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But what's also going on with people living in closer proximity to one another is population is booming, and more people were immigrating. Not just in the United States, this is where you get a lot of famous stories of people coming from Europe to America, but also just within Europe itself, people were moving around a whole lot thanks to the drive that was needed for these kind of jobs that were created by industrial capitalism. And sort of, I guess you could say, the brighter side of industrial capitalism was that these new ways of production and consumption were creating goods that were cheaper and more accessible to people. Now, not necessarily the poorest people in society, but these kinds of goods were making their way down from the very rich to, at the very least, middle class or lower middle class people. And this happened through the creation of department stores, mail order catalogs, and the corner store that we know today was in many ways born in this era. Because again, more people are living in cities, more people have miscellaneous needs that they need. It could be food, it could be other supplies, and that's where corner stores that we understand today were born in this time period. And thanks to these changes, more people able to travel more, right? So, thanks to trains, later, of course, airplanes, but that's not really going to be available to people until the 20th century. But people were able to travel more, creating our modern vacation and leisure time. So again, life as we understand it today is really starting to be born and starting to be shaped by all of these changes. More people are living in cities. People are working in factories. And that's allowing them to create goods that are being sold in department stores, through mail order catalogs, which, again, I want to be clear, that's like the Amazon of the 19th century, where, you would get a catalog, you'd say, okay, I want this, this, and this. You'd mail off your order, and then they would send you the stuff. Now we do all of that online, but the mail order catalog is in many ways the early Amazon. And we're just seeing our modern life and the patterns of life that we understand today were born in this time period. Now, industrial capitalism was broken into three classes of people, you could say at the broadest sense. So the societies in North America and Europe, in particular, saw these social classes emerge thanks to industrial capitalism. On the top were the capitalists. These were the rich and powerful who owned the land, the factories, and wealth, which was powering new societies. These were the rich people building the kind of houses that you see, in Philadelphia, these old houses that are historic landmarks, these giant mansions, these giant estates. These are the people who own the factories. These are the people who own the railroads. These are the people who own the ship lines. These are the people who were the first people to have electricity in their house, the first people to have telephones. They were the ones who were getting the most out of this new society with its huge changes and technological development. They were the rich. They were the powerful. They had access to politics. They had access to all of the things that were changing in the society for the better. So again, capitalists were the rich and powerful who owned the land, factories, and wealth, which was powering this new society. The second class, sort of a step down from the capitalists, a significant step down from the capitalists, were middle-class people. And these were the managers of new factories and other capitalist enterprises. And they were they were professionals like lawyers, doctors, things like that. These were people who were, in many ways, the real beneficiaries of industrial capitalism because they gained the most. Many of them used to be the third class of people we'll talk about, working class people, but thanks to their education or their connections or the fact that they started here with a little bit more money than other people, they were able to rise into a more comfortable style of living. And they were the real beneficiaries of this because there have always been rich people. There have always been rich and powerful people. The way in which they owned the land and how they controlled society changed with industrial capitalism, but that had always existed. This new middle class managerial and professional class was in many ways brand new with industrial capitalism, and the people who rose into that class were new. They were the first time, they were the real beneficiaries of what was going on here because, again, they had previously not had the kind of security and comfort that they were able to get from the economic and social changes that were ongoing thanks to industrial capitalism. And then that brings us to the third class, the working class. These were the men, women, and children who worked in the new factories and overstuffed the new cities. They were paid low wages, they lived in dangerous conditions, and they worked in hazardous environments to fuel the Industrial Revolution. The working class was the overwhelmingly largest class of people in Europe and North America. They were the people who were powering all of these changes, but they were getting the least from it. In many ways, their social position was declining thanks to this, because as we talked about earlier with the assembly line and other changes in factory work, working class people's jobs were much less stable. They were more interchangeable. They were more open to being exploited by their owners and their managers, by the owners of the companies and their managers. So working class people, while they were the fuel of industrial capitalism, they were the least beneficiaries of it. And they were the ones who were getting the least, even though they were the majority of society. So looking at these three classes overall, what we can really say is this was a massively unequal society, where you had a very few group of capitalists at the top who were gaining the most. They owned the factories, they owned the wealth. They were the ones who were saying where the new society was going, and they were, in many ways, the biggest winners. Then you had a small group a larger than the capitalist class, but still a small group of people, the middle class, who, a generation ago may have been working class people, but were now raised up into this more comfortable class of managers and professionals. And while they gained the most, they still didn't have as much as what the capitalists did, but they definitely had way more than most working class people. But there's still a small group of people. And then the overwhelming majority of people in these societies were working class people, all right? And their lives were very precarious. They were poor with bad diet, unstable working conditions, inconsistent income, and things were just very difficult. So this was a massively unequal society, and that's going to cause a lot of rifts. And many of the things that we're going to talk about later, imperialism, militarism, and imperial alliances were meant to paper over the differences in these societies and to try to keep things together in this massively unequal society that was in many ways a bomb waiting to go off in class conflict and social conflict over, again, a society that's massively creating all this wealth, but it's concentrated in the top 5% at most of society. So that brings us to the first way in which these societies are going to try and manage this class conflict and the inequality of the society, which is imperialism. So what is imperialism? Well, the basic definition of imperialism is that it involves a country extending its power by taking over territory controlled by another country. Imperialism has existed for a long time in human history. It's not just something of the 19th century or the early 20th century or the 20th century or the 21st century. Imperialism and countries extending power over one another is something that is a deep theme in human history. But what historians call this era is they call it the new imperialism, all right, which particularly because it saw a massive expansion of imperialism by a very small group of countries over the rest of the world. And those countries are largely European countries, Great Britain, Germany, and France. So what separates the imperialism of the 19th century particularly the late 19th century, from earlier imperialism was that it's only a few countries are really the winners of it. And those are largely powerful European countries like Great Britain, Germany, and France. And, of course, the United States a little later. And we'll talk a little bit about the United States when we get to World War I and its role in this. So the thing that's important to understand about this new imperialism is that it's linked with industrial capitalism. So new technologies developed in industrial nations gave them an edge over other countries, both countries that they're trying to take over, but also countries that want to take over other countries. So in competing among each other, countries with the best technology had an edge in taking over other parts of the world. And when they took over other parts of the world, the resources that they stole from those countries, be they in Africa, Asia, or the Americas, fueled their own industrial capitalism. So there's this circle where technology allows European countries like Great Britain to take over other parts of the world. They steal resources from those parts of the world, which lets them make more technology, which lets them take over more parts of the world, which lets them steal more raw resources, which lets them take over more parts of the world. It's this constant reinforcing circle of sort of this new imperialism that allows these countries like Great Britain, like France, and Germany to become so powerful, to become so rich. And it's important, and I really want to emphasize the bottom line here. Industrial capitalism was powered by the massive expansion of imperialism by Europeans during the 19th century. The wealth and resources that they stole from other parts of the world fueled Europe's massive wealth and power. You can't have one without the other. They were in this symbiotic circular relationship, which again, I have this imperialist cycle here that's, with industrial development is going on, which leads to advanced technology, which makes it easier for Europeans to take over other parts of the world, which means they can steal more resources and more labor from other parts of the world, which goes back up to the top, which furthers more industrial development, which leads to more advanced technology, which leads to more conquests, which leads to more stolen resources, and the circle just keeps going over and over and over and over again. So why is this particular brand of European imperialism possible? I've already talked about the advanced technology. I've talked about industrial capitalism, which means that more colonies equals more wealth for these people. Europeans also had a growing population. They had big armies and they had big navies that allowed them to, again, take over parts of the world. You need an army to take over other parts of the world. And then what also allowed Europeans to justify this massive destruction of other cultures and other societies for their own benefit was racism. Racism is central to the European imperialism because it allowed Europeans to justify extremely barbaric actions for their own benefit. Because Europeans in this period believed that their own culture and religion was superior to everywhere else in the world, superior to African culture, superior to Latin American culture, superior to Asian culture, and they believed that they were civilizing the world by, and it's important to put in scare quotes, civilizing the world by conquering other parts. So by bringing their supposedly superior culture and religion to other parts of the world, they were doing a good thing. Now, we understand today that that was just a justification for their actions, their evil actions. But many Europeans did believe this, and this is how they justified themselves. Their racism allowed them to come to terms with the fact that they were exploiting other parts of the world, destroying other societies, massively damaging long-standing cultures for their own benefit. But they could say to themselves that they were doing something good. So what this new imperialism leads to is a massive transfer of wealth and power to Europe, making it the wealthiest place in the world. Parts of the world are brought under foreign control for the first time. For example, Central Africa and China had not really been put under European control in earlier parts of European expansion. When you think about Columbus and other times that Europeans began taking over other parts of the world, they hadn't been able to take control of places like China or Central Africa. But during this period, that's what happens, is thanks to the things that we talked about earlier. And the largest consequence, besides the massive transfer of wealth and power to Europe, is the massive deaths of native people throughout Africa, Asia, and the Americas. All right? Imperialism required massive wars to succeed. And imperialized people were not passive victims. They fought back long and hard. Europeans didn't just show up one day and people say, oh, okay, you're in charge. No, they fought back, they resisted, and that leads to wars and destruction. And the people trying to maintain their independence and agency over their own lives leads to resistance and leads to wars. And European advanced technology gave them an edge in these wars, but it wasn't like Europeans didn't die as well in these wars. And this combat over this leads to lots of destruction. And then once Europeans take over, they are very cavalier with the lives of the people that they've conquered. We got to go back to the racism. They didn't view these people as the same as Europeans, and they viewed their lives as expendable and were willing to lead these societies to their destruction as long as those resources ended up in Europe and those wealth ended up in Europe. And as you can see here with this map, how much of the world was brought by this time period under European control, and the United States is on here as well. So you can see just huge swaths of the world are brought under European control in this period. So to just give you a big overview of the impact and scope of this, in 1500, European powers controlled about 7% of the world's land. By 1800, they controlled 35%. By 1914, which is the beginning of World War I, they controlled 85%. Overall, it's really important for me to emphasize this. The new imperialism is one of the greatest crimes in human history, and it massively enriched Europe at the expense of the rest of the world. And it is one of the key things, the competition between Europeans over who gets to conquer what parts of the world is going to be one of the biggest drives for World War I when we talk about that. So that brings us to the end of this part of my lecture about 19th century world history and European history. The next part we're going to talk about, as you can see with this slide, we're going to talk about nationalism and the other remaining three themes. So you can find the link to the second video in the comment in the information below this, and I hope you found it informative. please make sure that you check this against your study questions, and take care.